You are looking at live pictures of the massive protests that continued in Tahrir Square throughout last night and into today, and as you can see, tonight. Protesters are demanding for Morsi to immediately step down and make way for new elections. For the latest from Egypt, here's RT's Beltrue.
Amid growing tensions across the country on the third day of nationwide protests against the president, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist group that the president hails from, released a statement saying they expect imminent attacks on Tahrir Square and Presidential Palace, which is witnessing anti-government demonstrations right now. They say this will be they don't know who's behind these imminent attacks. They talk about that it's set up to frame the Muslim Brotherhood and divide the nation. Some people are dismissing this statement as a means of them trying to get people to leave anti-government demonstrations in fear. However, the clock is ticking for the president. The 48-hour window the military have given him to meet the demands of the people is closing with hundreds of thousands of people coming back to the streets calling for his ouster. They say they've had enough. The president is unable to rule. They've seen no change in the last year, and they're staying put until he resigns. The president appears to be losing support from within his own administration. We've already had 5 ministers resign in the last few days, and today 2 presidential spokespersons and the spokesperson to the cabinet have also resigned. The president, for his part, has met with the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense in a bid to try and solve this crisis. However, many are predicting that we may see presidential elections coming soon. In addition, we've had comments from the US President Obama, who's called on Morsi to listen to the people, saying that democracy is not just through a ballot box. This comes amidst growing fears from the Americans. The US Embassy has closed after there has been a lot of anti-American sentiment expressed in protests here on Tahrir Square and also in the Presidential Palace. I've certainly seen a lot of banners targeting the US ambassador to Egypt and Patterson, and saying that the Muslim Brotherhood is following a US agenda. What's happening right now is a severely divided Egypt with tensions rising and expected violence on the horizon.
In which the word means rebel in Arabic, began on May 1st on Labor Day here in Tahrir Square by a group of grassroots activists, many of them tied to the Kafaya movement, which was formed in 2005 against Hosni Mubarak. And they drafted a very simply worded petition on paper against Mohamed Morsi that used colloquial Arabic, not classical Arabic, and it called on people to sign their name, put their ID number in, and say they want Mohamed Morsi to step down and call for early elections. They began handing out this petition, and it very quickly gained traction. People would photocopy it and hand it out in schools and universities, even in government offices. And within the first month, the campaign said they gained 7 million signatures, and the latest number they gave just a couple of days ago was that they gained 22 million signatures calling for Morsi's ouster. This is an unverifiable number, but certainly the number of people that have signed is indeed very, very large, and this was manifested, like we saw yesterday, in this incredibly massive turnout. So the Tomorrow campaign is leading calls for an escalation tomorrow. However, it must be said that elements of the former regime have somewhat taken over the narrative in many respects, especially on the media and in the newspapers, and have called for the army to step in, for the army to take over and force Mohamed Morsi out of office. Of course, remember that the army came to the helm of power after Mubarak's ouster and led the beginning of the transition. They also caused a number of massacres in the streets, 12,000 people put on military trial, yet despite that there are large portions of the Egyptian populace that are calling for the army to step in. We saw yesterday military helicopters flying low over the crowds. Whenever they did, the crowd would cheer. When protesters passed military buildings, they would cheer and salute the officers standing inside. So this is another development, and we're waiting to see what the response from the military will be. You can hear behind me, there's still thousands of protesters in Tahrir Square and also at the Presidential Palace. What happened yesterday was really one of the largest protests, some are calling it the largest in Egypt's history. A massive turnout that saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people take to the streets, fill Tahrir Square, fill the Presidential Palace, and not just in Cairo, but in Alexandria, in cities across the Delta, and in Upper Egypt as well. really a mass display of dissent that goes to show the revolutionary spirit in Egypt is still very much alive. And this came, of course, as you mentioned, on the first anniversary of the inauguration of President Mohamed Morsi. He was elected 1 year ago with a very thin majority, 51% majority, against a stalwart of the former regime, Ahmed Shafiq. And since then, there has been growing polarization amongst the political class, with the Muslim Brotherhood withdrawing more into itself and its Islamist supporters. They've even lost support amongst some Salafi groups as well. While on the street, and the lives of ordinary Egyptians have become much harder. Prices of food and medicine and other staple goods have gone up. Crime and insecurity and vigilante violence has increased. There's electricity blackouts now in the hot summer months that occur every day. There are fuel shortages that cause tremendously long lines, that cause stifling traffic around the country. And so what we saw yesterday was a coming together of Egyptians from many different walks of life, from ordinary Egyptians who are fed up with the difficulties of everyday life that have only worsened in this last year and since the revolution began, to members of the political class who are opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, to members who are tied to the former regime, who took to the streets to try and oust the Muslim Brotherhood as well. So it was really a very large display of dissent. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you mentioned, had its own rally in a square not far from the presidential palace. It was rather large, but in comparison to the turnout that we saw yesterday of anti-Morsi protesters, it was quite small. And as you mentioned, the response from the presidency has been to largely ignore, and it seems that they want to try and weather out the storm, saying that democracy, dialogue is the only way forward. There's been many calls for dialogue over the past year. Much of them have been rejected by the political opposition, who say that the Morsi government and the Muslim Brotherhood just want to talk and not actually put any of their ideas into action. So as it stands right now, the Tamarrud campaign, which we can talk about a little bit more, the campaign that really started the calls for this protest that took place yesterday, has given Mohamed Morsi until 5 p.m. tomorrow to respond and to step down and call for early elections. If he doesn't, they're saying they're going to call for an escalation, further protests, more civil disobedience, and possibly calling for a general strike.
Cairo's Tahrir Square, where the crowds have been the largest since the 2011 revolution that ousted President Hosni Mubarak. Tens of thousands of people remain in Tahrir Square and outside the presidential palace, vowing to stay until Morsi steps down.
I am part of this revolution because this regime is worse than its predecessor. At least we didn't have the problems we are seeing now, with no water, electricity, fuel. There's nothing. It gets worse every day. So he should leave and let us choose someone else. And this time we need to choose correctly.
Protesters accuse Morsi of failing to address crucial economic and security problems in the year since he assumed power. Critics argue that the country's first Islamist president has put the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood Party ahead of the country's wider interests. Anti-government demonstrators reportedly ransacked the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters in Cairo and set it ablaze. Egyptian security forces said 8 people have been killed in clashes around the headquarters since Sunday.
Kenyan college student from Chevy Chase, Maryland. Officials said he died of his injuries after being stabbed in the chest during protests in the coastal city of Alexandria late on Friday.
The ministry has confirmed were killed yesterday alone. 8 of them in front of the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters, where protesters had gone, began throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters. People inside began firing either with birdshot or with live ammunition as well, and killed 8 people. And there have been deaths across the country as violent clashes have ensued between protesters and the Muslim Brotherhood. The police was really nowhere to be seen in the streets yesterday. They had announced earlier that they would not protect or side with any political group, but notably they left protesters to attack the Muslim Brotherhood, and in fact some police were seen protesting alongside the anti-Morsi groups. As you mentioned also, these tensions have been increasing over these past few weeks, and people have died in these clashes, and the American student died, was stabbed in the chest on Friday in Alexandria during a protest. Unclear why the circumstances exactly surrounding his death. He was apparently stabbed while he was photographing or filming the protests. There's been rising anti-American sentiment from many sides of the political spectrum in Egypt. Just a couple of months ago, an American professor at the American University in Cairo was stabbed in the neck outside the U.S. Embassy here. So there's an increasing anti-American sentiment from the anti-Morsi protesters and from the Muslim Brotherhood as well. Anti-Morsi protesters see the U.S. as siding with the Brotherhood, and there have been a lot of angry sentiment against the U.S. Ambassador Ann Patterson for calling on the opposition not to engage in mass-scale protests, but to rather engage in dialogue. We saw photos of her yesterday in Tahrir and on the streets with her picture crossed out. So there's increasing anger at the United States. And just finally to add, the U.S. administration, Secretary of State John Kerry, very quietly approved the $1.3 billion in foreign military assistance. That is the annual aid the U.S. gives to the Egyptian military here, despite the arrest and the conviction of 43 NGO workers who were sentenced to between 1 and 5 years in prison, including 15 Americans who were tried in absentia, except for one of them. Secretary of State John Kerry waived those concerns in Congress and allowed this foreign military assistance to go forward. And the letter that was leaked to the Daily Beast, you can read, includes the reasons of stopping attacks from Gaza into Israel, allowing U.S. warships through the Suez Canal, allowing U.S. military overflight rights over Egypt. So again, trumping security and military concerns, trump concerns of democracy and human rights and justice, which has been the policy, the U.S. policy for some time now towards Egypt.
The defining moment that made us realize there was no hope was the Constitutional Declaration. This marked the beginning of division in society, and then followed the string of violence, and people started to feel the government was truly tyrannical and have no intention to relieve power. So all the fears and doubts people had, which we brushed off and said, maybe it will happen and such, we realized it was in fact a reality. So the Constitutional Declaration and the insistence on making the Constitution pass at any price, which they openly confronted us, was the main mistake. Since last December, up until today, there has been no stability at all, and even a path for resolving the division is no longer there.
And legitimacy, well, there will be people opposing the new president, too, and a week or a month later, they will ask him to step down, said Morsi. If you can comment both on Mar of the April 6th youth movement and what President Morsi said, Sharif.
Well, Ahmed Maher, the founder of the April 6th movement, was referring, of course, to the constitutional declaration that Morsi made last November, which really sparked the first uprising against his rule, in which he placed himself above the judiciary. His decisions could not be overruled by the courts, and he used that power to help force through a constitution that was very divisive and rejected by many members of the opposition and of Egyptian society. We also saw the first real major clashes between the Brotherhood and protesters, resulting in 10 people dead after Brotherhood members cleared a sit-in at the presidential palace. So that really marked the beginning of this mass opposition and increasing polarization in the country against Mohamed Morsi's rule. Morsi, of course, as you mentioned, spoke to The Guardian, saying he would not step down, that it sets a dangerous precedent. I think it's important to remember that what we're seeing in Egypt is an increasing alienation and dissatisfaction with this democratic process. Egyptians have gone to the polls more than 4 times over the last 2 years, and their lives have not been improved in any way. The political class is seen as removed more and more from the lives of ordinary Egyptians and talking about things that don't relate to them. And so we continually see this tug of war between conventional politics and revolutionary politics. And revolutionary politics is the street, and that's what we saw an explosion of yesterday. So we'll have to see how it goes forward. It looks like the Brotherhood is hoping, and Mohamed Morsi is hoping, to weather this storm out. The month of Ramadan, where Muslims fast during the day, is starting in a week, where many suspect that protests will die down as a result of that. Perhaps they're hoping to make it through until then. But if they do not respond to this mass dissatisfaction, this mass call for some kind of change, then I can only imagine that Egypt will become increasingly unstable and increasingly ungovernable.
Sharif, there's just news in from the Guardian Live blog that a number of ministers have resigned from Morsi's government. The news agency MENA said 5 ministers have quit. The Egypt Independent says they include Hatem Bagato, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs Minister, and Atif Helmi, Minister of Communication. Broadcast journalist May Kamel said they resigned in solidarity with the protesters. Could you comment on the significance of this very quickly before we conclude?
Right, I heard that news before, that some cabinet ministers may have resigned. This follows a pattern, really, of resignations from Morsi's government, including many of his advisors that resigned in the wake of the constitutional declaration in November, and goes to really point to an increasing isolation of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party as a political group that is increasingly alone in ruling the country and not reaching out to any other political groups. Well, Mohamed al-Baradei and other leading members of what's called the National Salvation Front, a loose coalition umbrella group of opposition parties that was formed in November, have over these months since then, leading up to this, have been increasingly they don't really lead the street as much. They have called for different things. They seem to be somewhat disconnected as a political group from the grievances of ordinary Egyptians. They did not lead the call for these protests that was led from a grassroots campaign that we mentioned before, Tamarrud. They have fully supported and backed these protests, have called for a civil disobedience campaign. And both Mohamed al-Baradei and Hamdin Sabahi, a Nasrist leader who came third in the first round of the presidential elections last year, have supported the protests wholeheartedly. With regards to members of the former regime, we've seen many members of the former regime take advantage of this groundswell of opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood, take to the airwaves with very shrill and polarizing language, accusing the Brotherhood of all kinds of things that really, many of which are not true, calling very openly for the military to step in and take hold of this transition. So this is really a mishmash of people who have come together. It remains to be seen where it'll head. Many young revolutionaries who are at the core of the ouster of Hosni Mubarak and have been at the core of dissent since then were very upset at these calls for the military to step in, at calls for warmly embracing members of the police who were protesting alongside them, the same police and the same military who killed over 1,000 protesters since this revolution began. So it really is a complicated political situation, and Egypt is increasingly unstable right now. But really the decision is in the hands of Mohamed Morsi to see how this goes forward.
What happen next?
Well, Andrew, I think he's got to step down. I think let's just pause and reflect on what we're witnessing now in Egypt. We are witnessing the largest anti-government demonstrations in history. And full credit to RT, because RT is about the only major news channel that's given this amazing event the coverage it deserves. We're talking about 1/4 of Egypt are actually out on the streets protesting. And he can't stay on. It's quite clear that the people have had more than enough of him. He's been an utter and total disaster in the year he's been in power. He's broken every single promise that he made when he was elected. And it's time for him to go. If he doesn't go, I think civil war could happen because, you know, people are extremely angry And they're angry about what happened in 2011 because they wanted radical change in 2011. They didn't just want Mubarak to be replaced by another pro-US Western puppet. And that's what's happened. There hasn't been any real changes to the economy. People are getting poorer. Unemployment's going up and up and up. And people want real change. They're not going to be content with just another US stooge in power in Cairo.
Do you think there's any regrets about ousting Mubarak at all, considering the state the country's in now?
If anything, the situation's got worse than under Mubarak. Unemployment has risen since 2011. Youth unemployment has risen. Bread prices have risen. Electricity prices have risen. The average Egyptian is worse off now than he was 2 years ago. And this is all to do with the fact that it wasn't a real change in 2011. What we had was popular uprising against Mubarak, but the US and the Western allies came in there and took control of the situation, engineered a result that was good for them. And it's quite clear that this is not good for the majority of Egyptians. They want radical changes. They want a change in economic policies. They want jobs. They want bread. They want cheap fuel prices. They're not getting it under Morsi. The situation has actually got worse.
So he has no choice but to step down. But if he did, who's the alternative candidate? Who's the new leader? Is there anyone viable waiting in the wings?
It's up to the Egyptian people to decide that by having a new election. And I don't take the line that his rule is valid because he won the election a year ago. He's broken every single promise. Everything he said. We could talk for 6 or 7 hours on all the promises that he's broken and the opposite things he's done. And really, it's up to the Egyptian people. It's not up to the US and to say who runs Egypt. And the interesting thing is the silence from the Western leaders about these massive protests. These are the biggest protests in history. Can you imagine if 7 million people in Venezuela, that's 25% of the Venezuelan population, were out on the streets protesting against the government there? We would have President Obama, we would have William Hague, John Kerry, etc., saying Maduro must resign. There's silence on Egypt. There's the biggest demonstrations in history against the government, and the West is saying nothing. And that proves us one thing, that the change we had in 2011 was merely a cosmetic change. Nothing changed, really. And this is the real revolution now we're witnessing in Egypt, and the people must have their say.
And Morsi says he will not step down. So what do you think he will do next to hold on to power?
Well, I think he's emboldened by, like Erdogan in Turkey, and the fact that the US doesn't want him to leave power. The Muslim Brotherhood and the US are in this together. The Muslim Brotherhood is helping the US achieve strategic objectives in the Middle East. The last thing the US wants is a socialistic government, a sort of Nasserite government in Egypt that would renationalize, change economic policies, stand up for Egyptians' interests and for the interests of ordinary people. So he feels that the West are behind him, like Erdogan. But the numbers here are bigger than in Turkey. Erdogan does have more support in Turkey than Morsi has in Egypt, I think. And the anger is out there. 20 million people on the streets. They're not going to leave. They're not going to go back home. They've got nothing to lose, Andrew, because youth unemployment is going up all the time. People haven't got jobs. They haven't got bread. They haven't got food. They've got nothing to lose here. And they're desperate. And I think Morsi has to accept that and to realise, the last year's been a disaster for Egypt. We need to have a proper radical changes in this country. No, I don't think it can get much worse. Morsi has just continued with the flawed policies of Mubarak, the Washington consensus policies of more privatisation, cutting benefits, etc. I mean, cutting subsidies on basic foodstuffs. The poor have got poorer. We need in Egypt a radically new economic model. The model that Egypt followed from 1952 to 1970 under Nasser was hugely successful for the majority of Egyptians. That was the fastest rise in living standards for ordinary people. Nasser was a great leader for Egypt in terms of ordinary Egyptians, and they are the kind of policies that Egypt needs to follow now and to break fully 100% with the flawed policies of the Mubarak era.
Okay. It seems very much that the army is essentially trying to determine the future, and that could well be a return to the past, because what is very striking is that there isn't an obvious alternative to Morsi. There isn't a clear figurehead for the opposition. So even if Morsi was to resign, there's nobody automatic to take his place, not least because the Constitutional Court had invalidated the elections to the Parliament. So that we have in Egypt a very, very difficult situation. There's only one person with any kind of democratic legitimacy, that's the president, and his own legitimacy is now under attack from huge crowds in the streets and from the army and the police who've refused to defend himself and his party. But whoever comes to power, or if Morsi stays in power, it's difficult to see that the basic problems of great poverty, dwindling resources coming into the country, terrible problems about paying for the import of vital resources, including food, that those can easily be resolved whoever is in power.
So what we're seeing now is a divided Egypt between those who are supporting the president, maintaining that he is legitimate, they will come to the streets and back him, even though the military has released this controversial ultimatum. Meanwhile, the opposition figures are saying that they won't stop until Morsi is ousted. The grassroots campaign who initially called for these protests to marod or rebel, they've said they will have ages of disobedience if he stays in office. So really we're seeing a continued deadlock with the military getting involved as well.